The old wooden cabin creaked as the morning wind swept through the Arizona mountains. Thomas Mitchell stood at his kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint the desert landscape in shades of gold and orange. 3 years had passed since he first drove down that dusty road, his truck loaded with everything he owned, running away from a life that no longer made sense. He was 34 now, though some days he felt much older. The lines around his eyes had deepened, carved by squinting. Against the desert sun and the weight of memories he tried to forget. His beard had grown longer and wilder than he ever would have allowed in his old life. When he wore a crisp park ranger uniform and had meetings to attend, the coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the small space with the rich aroma that had become his morning ritual. Thomas poured himself a cup and stepped onto the front porch, breathing in the clean mountain air. No car horns, no traffic, no neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls. Just the sound of wind through the pine trees and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. This was exactly what he had wanted when he left Colorado. After the accident, after the funeral, after months of well-meaning friends telling him he needed to get back out there and start living again, he had finally understood that he needed to disappear for a while. Maybe forever. The Salt River ran about half a mile from his cabin, winding through red rocks and desert vegetation like a silver ribbon. Thomas had bought this place from an old rancher who was tired of the isolation. The man had warned him that winters could be brutal and summers scorching, that the nearest grocery store was 40 minutes away, and that cell phone service was spotty at best. Thomas had signed the papers that same day. His routine was simple, and that was how he liked it. Wake up before dawn, coffee on the porch, then down to the river to check the fishing lines he set the night before. Sometimes he caught enough trout for dinner, sometimes he opened another can of beans. It didn't matter much either way. 3 mornings a week, he drove his old pickup truck to nearby ranches where he fixed fences, repaired water pumps, or helped move cattle. The work was hard and honest, and the ranchers paid him in cash without asking too many questions about his past. They seemed to understand that some men came to the desert to lose themselves, and they respected that choice. The rest of his time, Thomas spent hiking the canyon trails, reading books by lamplight, and slowly repairing the cabin with his own hands. He had learned carpentry from YouTube videos and trial and error, replacing rotted boards and fixing a leaky roof one shingle at a time. The work kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. People in the nearest town, Cedar Creek, knew him as the quiet guy who lived up in the hills. He bought supplies once a week, speaking only when spoken to, paying for groceries and gas with a polite nod. The store clerk, an elderly woman named Betty, had stopped trying to make conversation after the first few months. Now she just smiled and told him to drive safe on his way out. Thomas had grown comfortable with the silence. In his old life, silence had been something to fill with television, music, or conversation. Now it was a friend that wrapped around him like a warm blanket. He could sit on his porch for hours, watching clouds move across the sky, without feeling the need to be anywhere else or do anything else. Sometimes, late at night, memories would creep back in. The sound of screeching tires, the hospital corridor that smelled like disinfectant and despair, the house that suddenly felt too big and too empty. On those nights, he would walk down to the river and listen to the water flowing over rocks, steady and eternal, washing everything downstream until it was gone. His ex-colleagues from the National Park Service had stopped calling after the first year. His brother in Denver sent Christmas cards that Thomas read once and then used to start fires in his wood stove. He had become a ghost from his former life, and that suited him just fine. The desert had its own rhythm, and Thomas had learned to move with it. He woke with the sun and slept when darkness fell. He ate when he was hungry and rested when he was tired. There were no deadlines, no appointments, no expectations from anyone about anything. Just the simple cycle of days passing one after another. On this particular morning, as spring warmed the high desert and wildflowers began to bloom along the riverbank, Thomas felt restless in a way he hadn't experienced in months. Maybe it was the changing season, or maybe something deeper, but he found himself wanting to explore a section of the river he rarely visited. It was farther downstream, where the water moved faster and the canyon walls rose higher on both sides. He finished his coffee, pulled on his hiking boots, and grabbed his fishing gear. The walk would take about an hour, but he had nowhere else to be. Time moved differently out here, stretching and contracting based on the rhythm of his steps and the warmth of the sun on his shoulders. As he walked, Thomas thought about how different his life had become. 3 years ago, he had been planning weekend camping trips and saving money for a bigger house. He had believed in the future in a way that now seemed impossibly naive. The accident had taught him that everything could change in an instant, that all the plans and dreams people built their lives around could disappear as quickly as smoke in the wind, but perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Out here, with no one to please and nothing to prove, he had discovered a kind of peace he never knew existed. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was something deeper and more stable. A quiet acceptance of what life had given him and what it had taken away. The trail wound through stands of juniper and oak, past rock formations that looked like ancient sculptures carved by wind and time. Thomas knew every bend and boulder along this path, every place where the morning light filtered through the trees just right. This land had become more familiar to him than any place he had ever lived. He reached the spot where he planned to fish, a deep pool where the river curved around a massive red rock. The water was clear and cold, fed by mountain snowmelt that would keep flowing long after the desert heat arrived. Thomas set up his gear with practiced movements, finding comfort in the familiar routine. As he cast his line into the moving water, Thomas had no idea that this day would be different from all the others. He couldn't know that within a few hours, his carefully constructed solitude would be shattered by a stranger's cry for help. He couldn't imagine that by sunset, his world would begin to change in ways that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and what he wanted from the years ahead. For now, he was just a man alone by a river, watching his line drift with the current, content in his isolation and certain that this was how his story would continue. The desert had taught him that some things were meant to last forever, unchanging as the rocks and sky. But the desert, like life itself, was full of surprises for those patient enough to wait for them. The morning mist hung low over the water like a thin white blanket, making everything beyond 20 feet look fuzzy and dreamlike. Thomas had been fishing for about an hour when he heard it. At first, he thought it might be a bird or maybe an animal drinking from the river upstream. But then the sound came again, clearer this time, and his blood ran cold. Someone was calling for help. Thomas dropped his fishing rod and stood up so fast he nearly lost his balance on the slippery rocks. The voice was coming from somewhere upstream, around the bend where the river curved sharply to the left. It was a woman's voice, high and desperate. Cutting through the morning quiet like a knife, he started running along the riverbank, his boots slipping on the wet stones as he fought to keep his footing. Branches whipped at his face as he pushed through the thick brush that grew close to the water's edge. His heart was pounding, not from the running but from a familiar panic that he thought he had left behind in Colorado when he rounded the bend. Thomas saw her. A young woman with long dark hair was fighting against the current about 30 feet from shore. The water was moving fast here, much faster than it looked from a distance, and she was losing the battle. Every few seconds, her head would disappear under the surface before she managed to pop back up. Gasping and flailing, Thomas could see what had happened. The riverbank had collapsed where she must have been standing, leaving a raw scar of red earth and exposed roots. The spring snowmelt had made the water higher and faster than usual, and what looked like solid ground had given way under her weight. She was being swept downstream toward a section of rapids that Thomas knew well. Rocky shelves and fallen trees created a maze of obstacles that could easily trap or injure someone. If she went over those rapids, especially in her current state of exhaustion, she might not survive. Without thinking, Thomas kicked off his boots and dove into the river. The shock of the cold water hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and making his muscles seize up for a moment. The river was fed by mountain snow, and even in late spring, it was cold enough to stop a person's heart if they weren't prepared for it. Thomas had spent years working in mountain streams and lakes during his time as a park ranger. His body remembered how to function in cold water, even as his mind struggled to process what he was doing. He hadn't tried to save anyone since the day he failed to save the person who mattered most. The current grabbed him immediately, pulling him downstream, faster than he wanted to go. Thomas angled across the flow, swimming hard toward where the woman was struggling. She had stopped calling for help, which worried him more than her earlier cries. That usually meant someone was running out of strength. When he got close enough, Thomas could see the panic in her dark eyes. She was young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of face that suggested she spent a lot of time outdoors. Her clothes were completely soaked, and her long hair kept getting in her eyes as she tried to keep her head above water. "I've got you," Thomas called out, though he wasn't sure she could hear him over the sound of rushing water. "Stop fighting the current. Let me come to you." But she was too panicked to listen, thrashing wildly as she tried to swim toward shore. This only made things worse, exhausting her faster and pulling her further from safety. Thomas could see that. She had maybe another minute before the cold water and physical exhaustion would overwhelm her completely. He put on a burst of speed, using a swimming technique he had learned in water rescue training years ago. Instead of fighting the current directly, he let it carry him downstream while angling across it, intercepting the woman's path like a defensive player cutting off a runner. When he reached her, she grabbed onto him with a grip, so tight it was painful. For a moment, they both went under as her weight and panic pulled them down. Thomas fought against the urge to push her away, remembering his training about panicked drowning victims. Instead, he wrapped one arm around her chest from behind, holding her head above water while using his other arm to swim. "Stop fighting," he said directly into her ear, his voice as calm as he could make it. "I've got you. Just breathe and let me do the work." Something in his tone must have gotten through to her because she finally stopped struggling. Her body went limp against his, and Thomas could feel her shivering violently from the cold water and shock. Now he had to get them both to shore before hypothermia set in. The current was still carrying them downstream, but Thomas used it to his advantage, swimming at an angle that would bring them to the far shore where the water was calmer. His muscles were screaming from the cold and the effort of supporting both their weights, but he kept swimming with steady, powerful strokes. It took what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes before Thomas felt his feet touch the rocky bottom. He half-carried, half-dragged the woman through the shallow water to the muddy bank, where they both collapsed in a heap of exhaustion and relief. They lay there for several minutes, both breathing hard and shivering uncontrollably. The woman was curled up on her side, her long hair plastered to her face, her lips already turning blue from the cold. Thomas knew they needed to get warm and dry as quickly as possible. "Are you hurt?" he asked, sitting up and looking her over. "For obvious injuries. Did you hit anything in the water?" She shook her head, still catching her breath. "I don't think so," she managed to say. Her voice had a slight accent that Thomas couldn't place, and her English was careful and precise, like someone who had learned it as a second language. "My name is Thomas," he said, pulling off his wet shirt and wringing it out. "What's yours?" "Maria," she replied, slowly sitting up and looking around as if trying to figure out where they were. "Maria Yazzie." The name told Thomas something about her background, but he pushed those thoughts aside for now. What mattered was getting them both warm and making sure she was really okay. "Maria, we need to get you out of those wet clothes and somewhere warm," Thomas said. "My cabin is about a mile from here. Can you walk?" She nodded, though Thomas could see she was still shaky. When she tried to stand, her legs wobbled and she had to grab his arm for support. The near drowning in cold water had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit. "Here," Thomas said, steadying her with one hand while scanning the area. "Let's take it slow. There's no rush now." As they started walking along the riverbank, Thomas couldn't help but notice how different this felt from his usual solitary mornings. For 3 years, he had avoided human contact as much as possible, building walls around himself that kept everyone at a safe distance. But something about pulling this woman from the water had cracked those walls in a way He hadn't expected. Maria walked beside him in silence, occasionally glancing in his direction with an expression he couldn't read. She seemed to be studying him, trying to figure out who he was and why he had risked his own life to save hers. Thomas found himself doing the same thing, wondering what had brought her to this remote section of the river so early in the morning. Neither of them spoke much during the walk back to his cabin, but Thomas was intensely aware of her presence. After years of solitude, having another person walking beside him felt strange and unsettling, like wearing shoes after going barefoot for months. What he didn't know yet was that this rescue would change everything that Maria Yazzie carried, with her stories and traditions and a way of seeing the world that would challenge everything Thomas thought he knew about himself. That saving her life would somehow end up saving his own. For now, they were just two strangers walking through the desert morning, both grateful to be alive, neither knowing that their lives had just become permanently intertwined. The walk back to Thomas's cabin took longer than usual. Maria was still shivering despite the warming morning sun, and her steps were unsteady on the rocky trail. Thomas found himself slowing his pace, staying close enough to catch her if she stumbled, but far enough away to give her space. When they reached the cabin, Thomas hesitated at the door. He hadn't had another person inside his home in over 2 years. The space suddenly felt too personal, too revealing of who he had become in his isolation. But Maria needed warmth and dry clothes, and his discomfort would have to wait. "It's not much," he said, opening the door and stepping aside to let her enter first. The cabin was small but clean, with handmade furniture and walls lined with books. A wood stove sat in one corner, surrounded by neat stacks of split logs. Maria's eyes took in everything quickly, and Thomas could see her making mental notes about this strange man who lived alone in the mountains. "I'll get the fire started," Thomas said, moving toward the wood stove. "There's a bathroom through that door if you want to clean up. I think I have some clothes that might fit you." Maria nodded but didn't move toward the bathroom. Instead, she stood in the middle of the room, water still dripping from her hair onto the wooden floor. Her arms were wrapped around herself, and Thomas could see that she was trying not to let her teeth chatter. "Actually," she said quietly, "I should probably go home. My family will be worried if I don't come back soon." Thomas paused with kindling in his hands. "How far is home?" "The reservation is about 10 miles south of here," Maria replied. "I can walk? In wet clothes?" "After what you just went through?" Thomas shook his head. "At least let me drive you. My truck is right outside." But Maria was already backing toward the door. "Thank you for saving me," she said formally. "I won't forget what you did, but I should go now." Thomas could see the wall going up between them, and he understood it. He had built plenty of walls himself over the past few years. But something about the way she was holding herself, like she was afraid to accept help, made him want to push back gently. "Wait," he said. "At least let me give you a jacket or something. You'll freeze walking 10 miles in those wet clothes." Maria hesitated, and Thomas could see her practical side warring with whatever was making her want to leave. Finally she nodded. A jacket would be helpful. Thomas went to his bedroom and pulled out a thick flannel shirt and an old denim jacket. When he came back, Maria was standing by the window, looking out at the desert landscape with an expression he couldn't read. "Here," he said, holding out the clothes. "Keep them as long as you need." Maria took the jacket but just held it instead of putting it on. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "Why do you live out here alone? This is a hard place to live." "By yourself?" The question caught Thomas off guard. Most people who knew about his situation didn't ask direct questions. They talked around it or avoided the subject altogether. But Maria was looking at him with genuine curiosity, not pity or judgment. "I needed to get away from my old life," he said after a moment. "This seemed like a good place to disappear." Maria nodded as if this made perfect sense to her. "Sometimes the land calls to people," she said. "Sometimes it's the only place that feels safe." Something in the way she said it made Thomas think she understood better than most people would. But before he could ask what she meant, Maria was putting on the jacket and heading for the door again. "Thank you for the clothes," she said. "And for saving my life, I mean that." Thomas watched her walk down the dirt road that led away from his cabin, her figure getting smaller until she disappeared around a bend. He stood in his doorway for a long time after she was gone, feeling strangely empty in a way he hadn't experienced since moving to the desert, 3 days past before. He saw her again. Thomas went about his normal routine, but he found himself thinking about Maria more than he wanted to admit. He wondered if she had made it home safely, if her family had questioned where she got the jacket, if she ever thought about their brief encounter by the river on Thursday morning. As he was replacing some rotted boards on his front porch, Thomas heard footsteps on the gravel road. He looked up to see Maria walking toward his cabin, carrying a small woven basket in her hands. She was dressed differently this time, in traditional clothes that Thomas recognized as Native American but couldn't identify more specifically. Her long hair was braided with what looked like small shells or beads, and she moved with the confident grace of someone completely comfortable in the desert environment. "I brought your clothes back," she said, stopping at the bottom of his porch. Steps and something else. Thomas set down his hammer and wiped his hands on his jeans. "You didn't have to bring anything else." "Yes, I did," Maria said simply. "You saved my life. That's not something you just say thank you for and forget about." She climbed the steps and set the basket on the small table where Thomas usually ate his breakfast. Inside, he could see what looked like fresh bread, some kind of dried meat, and small clay pots that probably contained food he had never seen before. "This is traditional food from my grandmother's recipes," Maria explained. "The bread is made with acorn flour and wild honey. The meat is venison jerky seasoned with desert herbs." Thomas was touched by the gesture, but also uncertain. He had lived alone for so long that receiving gifts felt awkward and complicated. "This is really thoughtful," he said. "But you don't owe me anything." Maria looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "This isn't about owing," she said. "This is about connection. When someone saves your life, you become connected to them. It's just how things work." She sat down in the other chair on his porch without being invited, which surprised Thomas. Most people waited for permission or at least some sign that they were welcome. But Maria seemed to operate by different rules. "I've been thinking about what happened at the river," she said. "I was there gathering medicine plants for my grandmother. She's a traditional healer, and she taught me which plants grow where and when to harvest them." Thomas sat down across from her, intrigued despite himself. "What kind of medicine plants?" "Willow bark for pain, sage for cleansing, different roots and leaves for different purposes," Maria explained. "My grandmother says the old knowledge is disappearing because young people don't want to learn it anymore, so she's teaching me everything she can before—" She trailed off, and Thomas could see pain flash across her face. "Before what?" he asked gently. "Before she's too old to remember it all," Maria finished. "She's 87, and her memory isn't what it used to be. Some days she forgets things. Important things." They sat in silence for a moment, and Thomas found himself wanting to say something comforting. But he had learned that sometimes the best thing to do was just listen. "Anyway," Maria continued, "I was looking for a particular plant that only grows near fast-moving water. I thought I knew that section of riverbank, but the spring floods changed everything. When I stepped on what looked like solid ground, it just crumbled away." "The river's been higher than usual this year," Thomas said. "More snowpack in the mountains than we've had in a while," Maria nodded. "My grandfather always said the river has its own mind. You can know it for 50 years, and it will still surprise you." Something about the way she spoke made Thomas curious. "Is your grandfather still alive?" "No, he passed when I was 12, Maria said. "But he taught me a lot about reading the land before he died, how to see things that aren't obvious." Thomas found himself genuinely interested in her stories. It had been so long since he had a real conversation with anyone that he had almost forgotten how good it could feel to exchange ideas with another person. "What do you see when you look at this place?" he asked, gesturing toward the desert landscape that stretched out in front of his cabin. Maria was quiet for a moment, studying the view as if she were reading a book. I see a man who came here to heal from something painful, she said finally. I see land that holds secrets and stories. I see a place where two different worlds meet. Her words hit closer to home than Thomas was comfortable with, but before he could respond, Maria was standing up and gathering her empty basket. I should go, she said, but I wanted to thank you properly for what you did. As she started to leave, Thomas remembered something. Wait, he called after her. You said you lost something in the river, a medicine bag? Maria stopped and turned back, her face clouding over. Yes, my grandmother's medicine bag. It was passed down from her grandmother and her grandmother before that. It had sacred items inside, things that can't be replaced. Thomas could see how much this loss meant to her, and suddenly he knew what he had to do. Can you describe it? The bag? Small leather pouch, about the size of your hand, with beadwork in red and blue patterns, Maria said. But it's probably long gone by now. The river carries things far downstream. Maybe, Thomas said, but maybe not. I know that stretch of river pretty well. If you're willing to wait, I could look for it. Maria stared at him as if he had suggested something impossible. You would do that? Spend time looking for something that probably doesn't exist anymore? I would do that, Thomas said, and realized he meant it. Something shifted in Maria's expression, and for the first time since he had pulled her from the water, she smiled. Thomas spent the entire next day searching the river for Maria's medicine bag. He started at the spot where she had fallen in and worked his way downstream, checking every eddy, every fallen log, every place where a small object might get caught. In the current, the water was clearer now that the spring floods had settled, and Thomas could see all the way to the bottom in most places. He waded through pools, felt around submerged rocks with his hands, and even used a long stick to probe areas too deep to reach. Other people would have given up after an hour or two, but Thomas had learned patience during his years of solitude. By late afternoon, his back was aching and his hands were numb from the cold water, but he kept searching. Something about Maria's face when she talked about losing her grandmother's bag drove him to continue. He understood what it meant to lose something irreplaceable, something that connected you to people you loved. Just as the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the water, Thomas spotted something dark wedged between two rocks in a quiet backwater pool. His heart jumped as he waded over and carefully worked the object free. It was the medicine bag, waterlogged and muddy, but intact. The beadwork Maria had described was still visible, though dulled by its time in the river. Thomas held it gently in his hands, amazed that something so small could survive such a journey. The next morning, he drove to the reservation for the first time since moving to Arizona. The landscape changed as he left the mountains, becoming flatter and more open, with scattered houses and trailers connected by dirt roads. He had an address that Maria had given him, but finding the right house took some time. When he finally located the small blue house with a vegetable garden in front, Thomas felt nervous in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He had grown so used to avoiding social situations that the prospect of meeting Maria's family felt overwhelming. Maria answered the door wearing jeans and a t-shirt, her hair loose around her shoulders. Her face lit up when she saw him, and Thomas felt that small flutter in his chest that he had been trying to ignore. "Thomas," she said, clearly surprised, "what are you doing here?" Instead of answering, he held out the medicine bag. "I thought you might want this back." Maria's eyes went wide, and she reached for the bag with hands that were suddenly shaking. "You found it," she whispered. "I can't believe you actually found it." She cradled the bag against her chest, and Thomas could see tears forming in her eyes. "How long did you look?" "Most of yesterday," Thomas said. "It was caught between some rocks about 2 miles downstream." Before he could say anything else, Maria had stepped forward and hugged him. It was quick and spontaneous, lasting only a few seconds, but it was the first time Thomas had been embraced by another person in 3 years. The contact sent a shock through his system that he wasn't prepared for. "Thank you," Maria said, stepping back but still holding the bag. "You have no idea what this means to me." "Maria, who's at the door?" came a voice from inside the house. "It's okay, grandmother," Maria called back. It's the man who saved me from the river. An elderly woman appeared in the doorway, moving slowly, but with dignity. She was tiny, probably not even 5 feet tall, but her presence filled the space around her. Her gray hair was braided with ribbons, and her dark eyes were sharp and alert despite her age. "This is my grandmother, Elena Yazzie," Maria said. "Grandmother, this is Thomas Mitchell." Elena studied Thomas with a kind of intense gaze that seemed to see right through him. "You're the one who pulled my granddaughter from the water," she sighed. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied, feeling like he was being evaluated for something important. Elena nodded slowly. "And you found her medicine bag?" "It took some searching, but yes." The old woman was quiet for a long moment, continuing to study Thomas's face. Finally, she spoke again. "Come inside. I want to talk to you." Maria looked surprised by her grandmother's invitation, but she stepped aside to let Thomas enter. The house was small but comfortable, filled with handmade furniture and traditional artwork. The walls were covered with family photos spanning several generations. Elena led them to a kitchen table where she had apparently been preparing some kind of meal. The smell of corn and herbs filled the air, making Thomas realize how long it had been since he had experienced home cooking. "Sit," Elena commanded, and Thomas obeyed. "Maria, make coffee for our guest." As Maria moved around the kitchen, Elena continued to watch Thomas. "She told me about you," the old woman said. "Said you live alone up in the mountains like a hermit." Thomas wasn't sure how to respond to that. "I prefer the quiet," he said finally. Elena snorted, a sound that might have been amusement. "A man your age shouldn't be hiding from the world." "What are you running from?" The directness of the question caught Thomas off guard. Most people danced around personal topics, but Elena seemed to have no patience for social niceties. "I lost someone important to me," Thomas said carefully. "I needed time to figure things out." "How long ago?" 3 years. Elena shook her head. 3 years is long enough to hide. Time to rejoin the living. Maria set coffee cups on the table and sat down across from Thomas. "Grandmother, maybe that's not our business." "Everything is our business when it affects family," Elena said. "And this man is connected to our family now. He saved your life, and he returned sacred items that were lost. That makes him family whether he knows it or not." Thomas felt overwhelmed by the casual way Elena was rearranging his world. "I appreciate your kindness, but I'm not really family material anymore." Elena fixed him with that penetrating stare again. "What was her name? The person you lost?" Thomas hesitated, then answered quietly, "Jennifer, my wife. Tell me about her." Something about Elena's tone made it impossible to refuse. Thomas found himself talking about Jennifer for the first time in years. How they had met during his ranger training, how she had loved camping and hiking almost as much as he did, how they had planned to have children and grow old together in the mountains. "She was driving home from work when it happened," Thomas said. "A drunk driver ran a red light. She died instantly." Elena nodded gravely. "And you blame yourself." "I should have picked her up that day. She asked me to, but I was busy with some project that seemed important at the time." "So you came to the desert to punish yourself for being human." Elena said matter-of-factly. Thomas looked at her, startled by how simply she had summarized 3 years of his life. "Grandmother," Maria said softly, "maybe we should talk about something else." "No," Elena said firmly. "This needs to be said." "Thomas, you think honoring your wife's memory means stopping your own life? But that's not how it works. The dead don't want us to die with them. They want us to live better because we knew them." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had never thought about it that way before. Elena reached across the table and patted his hand with her small, weathered fingers. "My husband died 20 years ago. I loved him more than my own life, but I didn't stop living when he passed. I lived twice as hard because I had to live for both of us." Thomas felt tears burning behind his eyes, emotions he had kept buried for so long that he had almost forgotten they existed. "You saved my granddaughter's life," Elena continued. "That tells me your heart is still working, even if you've been trying to turn it off. Maybe it's time to let it work properly again. They sat in silence for several minutes, Thomas struggling to process what Elena had said. Finally, Maria spoke up. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" she asked. "I was planning to make traditional fry bread and stew." Thomas looked around the small kitchen, at Elena's kind but knowing eyes, at Maria's hopeful expression. For the first time in 3 years, the prospect of sharing a meal with other people didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like something he might actually want to do. "I'd like that," he said, as Maria began preparing dinner. Elena told Thomas stories about the reservation, about the old days when her grandmother was young, about the traditions that were slowly being lost as the modern world encroached on their way of life. Thomas found himself genuinely interested, asking questions and sharing his own knowledge about the land and wildlife in the area. When dinner was ready, they sat around the small table and ate together. The food was unlike anything Thomas had tasted, rich with flavors he couldn't identify, but somehow made him feel connected to something larger than himself. "This is incredible," he told Maria. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My grandmother taught me," Maria replied. "She says cooking is another form of medicine. The right food prepared with the right intentions can heal more than just hunger." After dinner, Elena excused herself to rest, leaving Thomas and Maria alone at the table. The evening light was fading outside, and Thomas knew he should probably head home, but he found himself reluctant to leave. "Thank you for finding my grandmother's bag," Maria said quietly. It meant everything to her, even if she didn't show it. "She showed it," Thomas said. "Just in her own way," Maria smiled. "She likes you, I can tell. She doesn't invite many people to stay for dinner. What about you?" Thomas asked, then immediately wondered where that question had come from. "What about me? Do you like me?" Maria was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "I think you're a good man who's been hurt badly," she said finally. "I think you're stronger than—" Over the next few weeks, Thomas and Maria fell into a pattern of spending time together that surprised them both. What had started as a simple friendship based on gratitude had grown into something deeper and more complicated. They would meet at the river where they first encountered each other, walking the trails and talking about everything from desert, wildlife to family traditions. Thomas learned that Maria worked as a teacher at the reservation school, specializing in traditional Apache history and culture. She was passionate about preserving the old ways while helping her students navigate the modern world. Maria discovered that Thomas had degrees in environmental science and wildlife management, knowledge that proved invaluable when she had questions about the ecosystem changes affecting traditional plant-gathering areas. Their conversations revealed how much they had in common despite their different backgrounds. Both loved the land with a fierce protective instinct. Both had experienced profound loss and learned to find strength in solitude. Both understood what it meant to feel responsible for preserving something precious that others might not value or understand. But as their friendship deepened, the differences in their worlds became more apparent and more challenging. The first real test came when Maria invited Thomas to attend a traditional ceremony being held at the reservation. It was a coming-of-age celebration for several young people in the community, and Elena had specifically asked that Thomas be included. "Are you sure about this?" Thomas asked when Maria extended the invitation. "I don't want to intrude on something sacred." "You wouldn't be intruding," Maria assured him. "My grandmother asked for you to come. In our tradition, when someone saves a member of the community, they become part of that community in a way. But I want you to understand what you're agreeing to." She explained that the ceremony would last most of the day and involve traditional dancing, singing, and rituals that had been practiced for hundreds of years. There would be expectations about how to behave, when to participate, and when to simply observe respectfully. "Some people might not understand why you're there," Maria warned. "Not everyone in our community trusts outsiders, especially white people. There's a lot of history there, most of it painful." Thomas spent days thinking about whether to accept the invitation. Part of him was honored to be included in something so meaningful to Maria and her family. but another part worried about being out of place, about inadvertently offending someone or making Maria uncomfortable by association. In the end, it was Elena who convinced him. She came to his cabin one afternoon, arriving in an old pickup truck driven by one of her nephews. "I hear you're having second thoughts about the ceremony," she said, settling into a chair on his porch as if she had been visiting for years. "I don't want to cause problems for Maria," Thomas admitted. "If my being there would create tension in your community, maybe it's better if I stay away." Elena studied him with those sharp eyes. "You think our traditions are so fragile that one respectful outsider could damage them?" "I think traditions are precious things that should be protected," Thomas replied. "Good answer," Elena said approvingly. "But you're missing something important. Traditions stay alive by growing and adapting, not by hiding from the world. Maria cares about you and you care about her. That connection is part of our story now, whether some people like it or not." She leaned forward in her chair. "Let me tell you something about my granddaughter. She's 28 years old, smart as anyone I've ever known, and she's been alone too long. You know why?" Thomas shook his head. "Because she's caught between two worlds, just like you are. She's too traditional for some of the modern men who court her, and too modern for some of the traditional ones. She needs someone who can see both parts of who she is and value them equally." Elena paused to let that sink in. "I've watched you with her. I see how you listen when she talks about our ways. I see how you ask questions because you want to understand, not because you want to judge. That's rare." "But I'm not Apache," Thomas said. "I don't share her culture or her history." "No, you don't," Elena agreed. "But you share something else. With her, you both understand what it means to be guardians of something important. You both know how to be alone without being bitter, and you both have room in your hearts for healing." The day of the ceremony, Thomas dressed carefully in clean jeans and his best shirt, wanting to show respect without pretending to be something he wasn't. When he arrived at the ceremonial grounds, he was struck by how many people had gathered. Families from across the reservation had come to honor the young people celebrating their passage to adulthood. Maria met him at the edge of the crowd, wearing traditional dress that took Thomas's breath away. Her long hair was decorated with silver ornaments, and her dress was made of soft leather with intricate beadwork that caught the morning light. She looked beautiful but also somehow different, more connected to something ancient and powerful than the woman he had come to know in casual clothes and hiking boots. "You came," she said, and he could hear relief in her voice. "Elena convinced me it was the right thing to do," Thomas replied. Maria smiled. "She has a way of doing that." She guided him through the crowd, introducing him to various family members and community leaders. The reactions were mixed. Some people welcomed him warmly, clearly having heard the story of how he saved Maria from drowning. Others were polite but distant, their body language making it clear that they had reservations about his presence. One man in particular, someone Maria introduced as Robert Bege, seemed openly hostile. He was about Thomas's age, dressed in traditional clothing that suggested he held some position of importance in the community. When Maria explained who Thomas was, Robert's expression darkened. "So you're the white man who's been spending time with Maria," Robert said, his tone making it sound like an accusation. "I'm the man who happened to be near the river when she needed help," Thomas replied evenly. Robert stepped closer, clearly trying to intimidate him. "We take care of our own here. We don't need outsiders playing hero." "Robert," Maria said sharply, "Thomas is here as my guest and my grandmother's. Please show some respect." "Respect?" Robert laughed bitterly. "Like the respect his people showed ours when they took our children away to boarding schools? Like the respect they showed when they broke every treaty they ever signed with us?" Thomas felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. He understood Robert's anger, even if it wasn't specifically directed at anything Thomas had personally done. The pain in the man's voice spoke to generations of betrayal and loss. "You're right to be angry about those things," Thomas said quietly. "I can't undo the past, and I won't pretend to understand what your people have gone through. I'm just here because Maria invited me, and I care about her." "You care about her?" Robert's voice rose, drawing attention from nearby families. What do you know about caring for an Apache woman? What do you know about our ways, our responsibilities, our connections to this land? Before Thomas could answer, Elena appeared at his elbow like a small but formidable guardian angel. Robert Bege, she said in a voice that could cut steel. That's enough. This man saved my granddaughter's life and returned sacred items to our family. He's earned the right to be here. Robert looked like he wanted to continue the confrontation, but Elena's authority in the community was absolute. He stepped back, with obvious reluctance. This isn't over, he muttered to Thomas before walking away. The ceremony itself was beautiful and moving, even though Thomas understood only fragments of what was happening. He watched young people receive blessings from their elders, participate in dances that told stories stretching back centuries, and accept responsibilities that would shape their adult lives. Throughout the day, Thomas was acutely aware of being watched. Some people seemed curious about him, others approving, still others skeptical or disapproving. He felt like he was walking a tightrope, trying to show appropriate respect and interest without overstepping boundaries he didn't fully understand. Maria stayed close to him for most of the day, translating when necessary and guiding him through the proper etiquette. Thomas could see that his presence was creating stress for her, putting her in the position of defending her choices to her own community. During one of the breaks between ceremonies, an elderly man approached them. Maria's face lit up when she saw him. Uncle Joe, she said, hugging him warmly. I want you to meet Thomas. Joe Yassi was Elena's brother, and his resemblance to her was unmistakable. He had the same sharp eyes and direct manner, though his approach was gentler. So you're the riverman, Joe said, shaking Thomas's hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone his age. My sister tells me you're learning about our ways. I'm trying to, Thomas replied. There's a lot I don't understand. Joe nodded approvingly. That's a good answer. Most white people think they understand everything after 5 minutes. You at least know what you don't know. They talked for several minutes about the ceremony, with Joe explaining some of the symbolism and history behind what Thomas was witnessing. Thomas found himself genuinely fascinated by the complexity and depth of traditions that had survived. Centuries of pressure to disappear. Can I ask you something? Thomas said eventually. Go ahead. Summer arrived in the Arizona desert like a furnace opening its door. The temperatures soared past 100 degrees most days, and the usual afternoon thunderstorms that brought relief seemed to have forgotten how to find the area. By mid-July, the situation had become serious. The reservation's main well was running low, and several of the smaller communities were facing real water shortages. Thomas first learned about the crisis when Maria mentioned it during one of their evening walks. They had taken the meeting just before sunset, when the heat became bearable enough to spend time outdoors. Their relationship had grown steadily since the ceremony, though they had both been careful not to push too hard or move too fast. The tribal council is having emergency meetings every day, Maria told him as they sat on a large boulder overlooking the valley. Some of the older people are talking about the old days, when droughts like this could last for years. Thomas had noticed the change in the landscape around his own cabin. The small creek that usually ran year-round had dwindled to a series of disconnected pools. His neighbors, the few ranchers scattered throughout the area, were hauling water for their cattle and talking about selling off herds they couldn't support. What can be done? Thomas asked. Are there emergency resources available? Some, Maria said. The state will bring in water trucks if things get bad enough. But that's expensive and temporary. We need long-term solutions. The conversation stayed with Thomas that night and for several days afterward. He found himself thinking about water systems and conservation methods, drawing on his background in environmental science to consider options that might not be obvious to others. During his years as a park ranger, Thomas had worked on several projects involving water conservation and sustainable resource management. He had also spent considerable time studying the traditional methods that indigenous peoples had used to survive in arid environments. An idea began forming in his mind. The next time he saw Maria, Thomas brought up his thoughts tentatively. I've been thinking about the water situation, he said. Would the tribal council be interested in hearing ideas from an outsider? Maria looked surprised. What kind of ideas? Thomas explained his background in water management and described some of the conservation techniques he had seen used successfully in other desert communities. Traditional methods like cistern systems and terraced gardening, combined with modern technology like drip irrigation and solar-powered pumps, could potentially stretch existing water supplies much further. The really interesting thing, Thomas sighed, warming to his subject, is that a lot of the most effective techniques are actually based on traditional Apache and other tribal methods. Modern science is just now figuring out what your ancestors knew centuries ago. Maria listened intently as Thomas outlined his ideas. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. You would really want to help with this? She asked. Even though some people in the community still see you as an outsider? Water doesn't care about politics or cultural differences, Thomas replied. Everyone needs it to survive. The next week, Maria arranged for Thomas to meet with several members of the tribal council. The meeting took place in a small conference room at the tribal offices, and Thomas felt nervous as he set up his presentation materials. He had spent days researching and preparing, wanting to make sure his ideas were both practical and respectful of local traditions. The council members who attended were a mix of ages and perspectives. Some, like Elena's nephew David, were younger professionals who had college degrees and experience working with outside agencies. Others, like elderly council member William Santos, represented more traditional viewpoints and were clearly skeptical about accepting help from a white outsider. Thomas began his presentation by acknowledging what he didn't know. I'm not from here, he said. I don't have generations of experience living on this land or understanding its rhythms. But I do have some technical knowledge that might be useful, and I'm hoping we can combine that with local wisdom to find solutions that work for your community. He outlined several potential projects, from small-scale household water conservation systems to larger community initiatives, like shared cisterns and efficient irrigation networks. Throughout his presentation, Thomas was careful to emphasize how each idea could be adapted to fit local needs and preferences. The questions that followed were pointed and sometimes challenging. William Santos, in particular, seemed determined to find flaws in every suggestion. Why should we trust you? Santos asked bluntly. White people have been coming here for over a century, making promises and offering help. Most of the time, that help comes with strings attached or benefits them more than us. Thomas had expected this question and thought carefully about how to answer it. You shouldn't trust me, he said finally. You should evaluate the ideas on their own merit and make sure any implementation is controlled entirely by your community. I'm not looking for credit or payment or ongoing involvement, unless you want it. I just want to help solve a problem that affects people I care about. David Yassi, who was Maria's cousin, leaned forward in his chair. What would you want in return? Nobody does this kind of work for free. I'd want to know that Maria and her family and the rest of this community have enough water to live comfortably, Thomas replied. That's all. The meeting lasted almost 3 hours, with extensive discussion about the practicality and costs of various options. By the end, even William Santos seemed grudgingly interested in some of the possibilities. We'll need to think about this, David told Thomas as the meeting concluded, and we'll need to discuss it with the full council. But thank you for your time and your ideas. As they walked out of the building together, Maria was unusually quiet. Thomas wondered if he had somehow overstepped or created problems for her by getting involved in tribal politics. Are you okay? He asked when they reached his truck. I'm fine, Maria said, but her tone suggested otherwise. It's just What you did in there was really something. The way you presented your ideas, how you handled William's questions. I don't think anyone expected that. Expected what? For you to really understand what this means to us. For you to offer help without trying to take control or get something in return. Maria paused, seeming to struggle with her words. Most Of the white people we deal with, even the ones who mean well, they want to be the hero of the story. You just want to be useful. Over the following weeks, as the tribal council debated Thomas's proposals and began implementing some of the smaller-scale projects, he found himself spending more and more time on the reservation. He helped install rainwater collection systems, taught workshops on water conservation techniques, and worked alongside community members to test different approaches. The physical work was demanding in the summer heat, but Thomas found it deeply satisfying in a way he hadn't experienced since his ranger days. More than that, he was learning about the community in ways that sitting in meetings or attending ceremonies could never teach him. He worked alongside teenagers who were more comfortable with technology than some of their elders, middle-aged parents who were juggling traditional responsibilities with modern jobs, and elderly people who remembered when life was much harder, but in some ways simpler. Each person he met added to his understanding of the complex community that Maria called home, but it was during the long evenings spent planning and problem-solving that Thomas began to realize his feelings for Maria had grown far beyond friendship, or even attraction. Watching her translate between different groups, mediate disagreements, and advocate for solutions that served everyone's needs, he saw a strength and wisdom that took his breath away. Maria had always been beautiful, but now Thomas understood that her beauty came from more than just her physical appearance. It came from her deep connection to her people and her land, from her ability to honor tradition while embracing necessary change, from her patience with people who disagreed with her and her persistence in fighting for what she believed was right. The moment Thomas fully understood that he had fallen in love with Maria came on a night in late August. They had been working until after dark, testing a new solar pump system that would serve 3 families in one of the more remote areas of the reservation. The project had been challenging, with several technical problems that required creative solutions. When they finally got the system working properly, pumping clear, cold water from a deep well into a storage tank, the small crowd of family members who had gathered to watch burst into cheers and applause. Children ran to splash their hands in the water, and their grandmother, a woman in her 70s, had tears in her eyes as she filled the first bucket. Thomas and Maria stood a little apart from the celebration, both exhausted but satisfied with what they had accomplished. The desert sky was brilliant with stars, and a gentle breeze brought relief from the day's heat. "Look what we did," Maria said softly, watching the families enjoy their new water system. 3 months ago, these people were hauling water in jugs from 20 miles away. Now they'll have enough for drinking, cooking, even a small garden if they want. Thomas looked at Maria's face in the starlight, seeing the joy and pride there, and suddenly understood that everything in his life had led to this moment. Robert Begay returned to the reservation on a Tuesday morning in September, driving a black pickup truck with military plates and wearing the kind of confidence that came from 4 years of service in the Army. Word of his return spread quickly through the small community, and by evening, everyone knew that Maria's former boyfriend was back home for good. Thomas first heard about it from David Yazzie, who stopped by the water pump project they were working on with a troubled expression on his face. "We need to talk," David said, pulling Thomas aside while Maria was helping an elderly woman connect her garden hose to the new system. "What's going on?" Thomas asked, though something in David's tone made his stomach tighten with worry. "Robert's back. Maria's ex. He's been asking questions about you, about your relationship with Maria, and he's not happy about what he's learned." Thomas had heard stories about Robert from various people over the past few months. He had grown up on the reservation, was considered by many to be a promising young man who would make a good husband for someone like Maria. His military service had only enhanced his reputation in the community. "What kind of questions?" Thomas asked. "The kind that suggest he thinks you don't belong here," David replied carefully. "Robert's always been protective of Maria, and he's not exactly known for his tolerance of outsiders." That evening, as Thomas and Maria drove back toward his cabin after another long day of work, Maria brought up Robert's return herself. "I suppose you've heard that Robert's back," she said, staring out the passenger window at the darkening desert landscape. "David mentioned it." Thomas replied. Do you want to talk about it? Maria was quiet for several minutes before answering. Robert and I dated for 2 years, ending about 6 months before I met you. We broke up because he wanted me to be someone I wasn't. He had very specific ideas about what an Apache woman should be like, how she should behave, what her priorities should be. What kind of ideas? Traditional ones, mostly. He thought I was too independent, too interested in working with outsiders, too willing to adapt our ways to modern circumstances. Maria sighed. He wasn't entirely wrong about some things. I do believe in preserving our traditions, but I also believe they need to evolve to survive in the modern world. Thomas could hear the tension in her voice and knew there was more too. The story, why did he join the army? Partly to see the world beyond the reservation, partly because we had a big fight about our future and he needed space to think. Maria turned to look at Thomas. He told me before he left that when he came back, he expected me to be ready to settle down and start a family the traditional way, and now he's back. And now he's back, Maria confirmed. And instead of finding me waiting for him, he's discovered that I'm involved with a white man who's been working in our community. The confrontation came sooner than Thomas expected. 3 days after Robert's return, Thomas was working alone at a remote water collection site when a black pickup truck pulled up in a cloud of dust. Robert Begay climbed out of the driver's seat, and Thomas could see immediately that this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. Robert had changed during his military service. He was broader through the shoulders, carried himself with military bearing, and had the kind of intense focus that came from serious training. But his face was familiar from the ceremony where they had first met, and the hostility in his expression was unchanged. We need to talk, Robert said without preamble. Thomas set down the wrench he had been using and straightened up. Okay, what's on your mind? What's on my mind is you, Robert replied, moving closer in a way that was clearly meant to be intimidating. You and your little game of playing savior to our people. I'm not playing anything, Thomas said calmly. I'm helping with water conservation projects that the tribal council approved. Robert laughed, but there was no humor in it. Right, the helpful white man who just happens to be sleeping with one of our women while he's helping us poor Indians figure out how to manage our resources. Thomas felt anger rising in his chest, but forced himself to stay calm. My relationship with Maria is between me and her. And I'm not sleeping with anyone, yet, Robert said. But that's the plan, isn't it? Win over the community with your expertise, make yourself indispensable, and then claim your prize. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, partly because they echoed some of his own worst fears about his motivations. Was he really helping the community, or was he just trying to prove himself worthy of Maria's love? That's not what this is about, Thomas said, but even to his own ears, his voice sounded less certain than he would have liked. Robert stepped closer, close enough that Thomas could smell the coffee on his breath. Let me tell you something about Maria Yazzie. She's not just some woman you picked up in a bar. She's the granddaughter of one of our most respected elders. She's a teacher who's responsible for passing on our culture to the next generation. She's spoken for by who? By me, Robert said flatly. We have an understanding that goes back years. Just because we took a break doesn't mean anything changed between us. Thomas felt his temper starting to slip. I think you'd better ask Maria about that understanding. I don't need to ask Maria anything. I know her better than you ever will. I know what she needs, what she wants, what's best for her future. Robert's voice was rising now. And what's best for her isn't some broken-down white man playing hermit in the mountains. The description stung because it wasn't entirely inaccurate. Thomas had been broken when he came to Arizona, and in some ways, he was still putting himself back together. Maybe you should let Maria decide what's best for her, Thomas said. Maria's confused right now, Robert replied. She feels grateful to you for saving her life, and she's mistaking that gratitude for something else. But gratitude isn't love, and it's not enough to build a life on. Before Thomas could respond, Robert continued. You want to know what I think? I think you're A man who lost everything and came here looking for something to fill the hole in your life. Maria's been kind to you, made you feel useful, and now you think that means she belongs to you. The words hit close enough to home that Thomas felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment. You don't know anything about me. I know enough. I know you've been hiding from the world for 3 years. I know you don't have family or friends or any kind of real life outside of this fantasy you've built around Maria. Robert's voice was cruel now, designed to inflict maximum damage. What happens when she realizes that loving you means cutting herself off from her community? What happens when she has to choose between her heritage and her white boyfriend? Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to tell Robert that he was wrong about everything. But the truth was that some of Robert's accusations hit uncomfortably close to home. Thomas had been isolated and broken when he met Maria. His feelings for her had grown, out of gratitude and loneliness as much as genuine attraction. And he had no idea how to answer the question about what would happen if Maria had to choose between him and her community. I love her, Thomas said quietly, and the words sounded inadequate even to him. Love her? Robert laughed harshly. You barely know her. You know, the version of herself she shows to outsiders, the one that's polite and accommodating. You don't know the real Maria, the one who dreams in. The confrontation with Robert left Thomas shaken in ways he hadn't expected. For days afterward, he found himself questioning everything about his relationship with Maria and his place in her community. The seeds of doubt that Robert had planted grew in the quiet hours when Thomas was alone at his cabin, making him wonder if he was really the right person for Maria, or just a convenient distraction from her real life. Maria noticed the change in him immediately. During their next evening walk, she asked him directly what was bothering him. Robert came to see me, Thomas admitted, not wanting to lie but unsure how much to share. I figured he would, Maria said calmly. What did he say? Thomas hesitated, then decided to be honest. He said I was using you to heal from my own wounds. He said you deserved someone who understood what it meant to be Apache, someone who could give you children who would carry on your traditions. Maria stopped walking and turned to face him. And what did you say? I didn't know what to say, Thomas replied. Because some of what he said wasn't wrong. I was broken when I came here. My feelings for you did grow out of gratitude and loneliness. And I don't know anything about raising Apache children or preserving traditions that go back centuries. They stood in silence for several minutes, watching the last light of day fade behind the mountains. Finally, Maria spoke. Do you want to know what I think? She asked. Thomas nodded, bracing himself for whatever she was about to say. I think Robert is scared, Maria said. He's scared that the world is changing and he can't control it. He's scared that I've grown into someone different than the woman he left behind. And he's scared that you represent everything he doesn't understand about how to live between two worlds. She started walking again, and Thomas fell into step beside her. Robert isn't wrong about some things, Maria continued. You were broken when you came here, but so was I in my own way. I was 28 years old and felt like I was failing at everything that mattered to my family. I couldn't make my relationship with Robert work. I couldn't figure out how to honor tradition while still living in the modern world. I felt like I was disappointing everyone, especially my grandmother. Thomas listened without interrupting, hearing things in Maria's voice that she had never shared before. When I fell in the river that day, I wasn't just gathering plants, Maria sighed quietly. I was running away from another fight with Robert about our future. I was angry and careless, and that's why I ended up in the water. This revelation surprised Thomas. He had always assumed the accident was just bad luck, not the result of emotional turmoil. You saved my life that day, Maria continued. But more than that, you showed me what it looked like when someone helped without trying to control or change the person they were helping. You gave me space to be myself without judgment. They had reached the spot by the river where they first met, and Maria sat down on the large boulder where they often ended their walks. Robert wants me to be the woman he thinks I should be, she said. You helped me become the woman I actually am. There's a big difference. Thomas sat beside her, feeling some of the tension he had carried since Robert's visit beginning to ease. But what about children?" he asked. "What about preserving your culture for the next generation?" Maria smiled, and in the gathering darkness her expression was soft and understanding. "Do you think culture is something that only gets passed down through blood?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "My grandmother's first husband died young, before they had children," Maria explained. "She married my grandfather when she was 30, and he had 2 children from his first wife who had died in childbirth. Elena raised those children as her own, taught them everything she knew about Apache ways. They grew up to be cultural leaders, even though they weren't her biological children." Thomas considered this. "So you think adoptive children can carry on traditions just as well as biological ones?" "I think love and commitment matter more than genetics," Maria replied. "I think children learn culture from the adults who raise them with intention and respect. And I think you would be an amazing father to any child who was lucky enough to have you." The conversation was moving into territory that felt both thrilling and terrifying to Thomas. They had never talked seriously about marriage or children before, and the possibility that Maria could envision such a future with him was overwhelming. "There's something else," Maria said, her voice becoming more serious. "My grandmother wants to talk to you, alone." "About what?" "I think she wants to decide whether you're serious about this relationship or just playing around." 2 days later, Thomas found himself sitting across from Elena Yassi in her small kitchen, drinking coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. The old woman had invited him for lunch, but Thomas suspected the meal was just an excuse for a more important conversation. "Maria tells me you've been having doubts," Elena said without preamble, cutting straight to the heart of the matter in her usual style. "Some," Thomas admitted. "Robert made some points that I'm having trouble arguing with." Elena snorted dismissively. "Robert Begay is a boy who went away and came back thinking the world should have waited for him. He doesn't understand that people grow and change." She poured herself more coffee and studied Thomas with those sharp eyes that seemed to see everything. "Let me tell you something about my granddaughter," Elena said. "She's stubborn, independent, and she doesn't do anything without thinking it through carefully. If she's chosen you, it's because she sees something in you that's worth keeping." Thomas felt honored by Elena's words, but also uncertain. "How do you know I won't hurt her? How do you know I'm not just using her to feel better about my own life?" Elena leaned back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was gentler than Thomas had ever heard it. "You want to know how I know? Because for 6 months, I've watched you work in our community without asking for anything in return. I've seen you learn our ways with respect and humility. I've watched you make my granddaughter happy in ways I haven't seen since she was a child." She paused to take a sip of coffee. "But most importantly, I've seen you struggle with exactly the questions you're asking me now. A man who was just using someone wouldn't worry about whether he was good enough for her." Elena stood up and walked to a wooden cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. She opened it and pulled out a small leather pouch, similar to the medicine bag that Thomas had recovered from the river, but older and more elaborate. "This belonged to my grandmother," Elena said, setting the pouch on the table between them. "It contains items that have been blessed by our medicine people, items that are meant to protect and guide whoever carries them." Thomas looked at the pouch but didn't touch it. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because I want you to have it," Elena said simply. Thomas was stunned. "I can't accept something that's sacred." "I'm not Apache." "No, you're not," Elena agreed. "But you're family now, and family protects family?" She pushed the pouch across the table toward Thomas. "In our tradition, when someone saves a life, they become responsible for that life. But it works both ways. The person whose life was saved also becomes responsible for their savior." Thomas still didn't touch the pouch. "I don't understand." "Maria saved your life just as much as you saved hers," Elena explained. "Maybe more. She brought you back from the dead place you were living in. She helped you remember how to be human again." The old woman's words hit Thomas with surprising force. She was right. Maria had saved him in ways he was only beginning to understand. So what happens now? Thomas asked. Elena smiled, and for the first time since he had known her, the expression was purely warm and welcoming. Now you stop asking permission to love my granddaughter and start figuring out how to make her happy for the rest of her life. That evening, Thomas drove to Maria's house with Elena's medicine pouch in his pocket and a heart full of certainty he hadn't felt in years. He found Maria in her backyard, tending to a small garden where she grew traditional herbs and vegetables. "We need to talk," Thomas said, and something in his voice made Maria set down her watering can and give him her full attention. "What is it?" "I love you," Thomas said, the words coming easier than they ever had before. "Not because you saved me from my loneliness, not because I'm grateful for your kindness, but because you're the most amazing woman I've ever known. You're strong and wise and beautiful, and you make me want to be a better man than I ever thought I could be." Maria's eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. "I want to build a life with you," Thomas continued. "I want to learn everything. You're willing to teach me about your culture and your traditions. I want to help you preserve what needs to be preserved and change what needs to be changed. I want to raise children with you who will grow up knowing they're loved and valued regardless of where their DNA came from." "Thomas," Maria said softly. "I know there will be challenges," he went on. "I know some people will never accept me. And I know I'll make mistakes because I'm learning as I go. But I also know that what we have together is worth fighting for." Thomas pulled Elena's medicine pouch from his pocket and held it out to Maria. "Your grandmother gave this to me today. She said it was for family." Maria gasped when she saw the pouch. "She gave you grandmother's medicine bundle?"